Well, we're going to ease into our afternoon. So thank you everybody for being back on time. We're just going to start with a little brief overview of how of this all-day seminar, which we didn't do initially at the beginning of the day. So really just touching very quickly on what we're doing here today and how we all came together. I guess I have to do this. Sorry, I am going to go very quickly, or I think I will be going very quickly. That's the wrong one.
The PowerPoint. Which one? Patrick Durivage PowerPoint.
Patrick Durivage. Thank you very much.
There you go. It's up.
Okay. So I just wanted to pay honor a little bit to Susan, who's not here with us today, but I did mention her this morning, who is part of the planning committee. We were given the privilege of putting this psychosocial all-day seminar together not that long ago, actually. So we had to quickly regroup and brainstorm and try to present the program that was interesting to psychosocial practitioners, and hopefully we're able to do that. So the overview of the seminar is to experience and knowledge with innovation, advocacy, and clinical practice. So we're trying to bring that together. So Terry's talk on experience and all that she could teach us about her experience with regards to social work palliative care. And innovation and advocacy and clinical practice, what Marnie brought us this morning as well, was some great tools and a framework in terms of clinical practice. So we hope that at the end of this seminar that you, the participants, will be able to appreciate the history and lessons learned regarding psychosocial practice in palliative care, have a better understanding of the psychosocial needs and challenges in the provision of palliative care, re-examine the interdisciplinary approach, and reflect on the importance of practice with individuals, families, communities within a societal context. We have a lot of hefty goals. We're very ambitious, and what we start this year, we hope to continue at the next Congress in 2024. So we appreciate your feedback on how the day was. Please fill out your evaluation forms. What you'd like to see in the future is very important to us as well, and if you want to connect with us, please do so as well. So we're very open to your feedback, and we really do appreciate that a great deal. I'm going to hand over the mic now to Patrick.
Maybe you could set up while I introduce you. So Maxxine Ratner, psychosocial specialist with the Canadian Virtual Hospice and founding member of the Canadian Grief Alliance. She writes, teaches, provides clinical supervision, and does research and advocacy work related to palliative care and end-of-life care. So we're quite pleased that she's part of this adventure with us. Very great collaborator, flexible, and was very a good team player in this process. So thank you very much for all your efforts and your time put to this event.
Thank you so much. Well, a very warm hello to each of you. As Patrick was just saying, my name is Maxxine. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm thrilled and really honored to be here today. I want to express my sincere gratitude to Zelda, Patrick, and Susan Blacker, as you know, couldn't be here today, for the invitation and opportunity to talk about my favorite topic, non-physical suffering. So, un grand merci. I love this conference. This is the third time I've had the privilege of being here. I find it's a conference for the mind, soul, and spirit. And unfortunately, I'm only here for a short time today due to some prior commitments, but again, really thrilled to be here. So today, I have the great privilege, I don't know, are the slides able to go up? Oh, I have to do that. Then they'll be right there. There we go. Okay. I'll just keep going. No? I don't think they're there. I gave them to Charlotte. Not sure.
It's Maxine Ratner. Her presentation was originally scheduled for the morning.
Yeah.
So
Someone told me to switch to the guy that was in the other room. It was this gentleman.
I don't know how this even goes back. Okay.
sorry, little break in the action.
Sorry, everyone.
Not to create any more.
Yeah, it's okay.
I think it's on.
You're good.
Oh, there we go.
Thank you.
Perfect. Yay, thank you. So as I was saying, today's topic is my favorite. I'll tell you why in a moment. I'm hoping to offer some tips and tools that I hope will support your own psychosocial practice in whatever role you have. So I have no conflicts of interest to declare. And these are the learning objectives that I think you'll see online. By the end of our time together, you'll be able to describe 5 key sources of patients' non-physical suffering, 3 of our own barriers that we experience exploring and addressing patients' non-physical suffering, 3 barriers patients experience sharing their non-physical suffering with us, and I'm hoping to share some new, or maybe not so new, clinical questions and tools to explore patients' non-physical suffering specifically for your own practice. So what is my why? Why do I talk about and spend so much time researching and writing about non-physical suffering? Well, for me, it started well over a decade ago now as a beginning clinician, as a hospice palliative care social worker. I found myself struggling to fulfill the expectations of the discipline of palliative care to prevent and relieve suffering, specifically non-physical suffering. All I knew as a beginning clinician in palliative care was that I was meant to help relieve this experience called suffering. After all, this is what the very definition of palliative care calls for, as you can see here. By a show of hands, who here in this room feels that preventing and relieving suffering falls within your scope of practice? Yeah, totally. Me too. I found that the call for us to prevent and relieve non-physical suffering, though, was sometimes possible and many times was not. This is actually a picture of a bedside at the hospice where I had the privilege of working in downtown Toronto for about a decade. You can hopefully make out a chair in the lower right-hand corner of the photo. And it was here, sitting in a chair like this, at a bedside like this, that I came to learn and know about non-physical suffering. I came to know and learn about it directly from patients and families, and I experienced a disconnect between what they taught me and what the palliative care literature and discourse was saying. It was here that I learned that dying is not necessarily a time that is filled with meaning or meaning-making or opportunities for personal growth or suffering's transcendence. Ideas pervasive in the palliative care discourse and literature and practice. When and if there are positive moments like these, and of course there are, they often sit alongside all of the difficult emotional and practical realities of leaving one's life and one's people behind. They sit alongside and not in the absence of suffering. For example, one of the first times I realized it was non-physical suffering I was encountering was with a patient, a dad in his early 50s who had 3 children in the teenage and young adult years. His husband had taken a leave from work, and one of his daughters was taking some time away from university. And he shared with me that though he did not want to die, he hoped his dying wouldn't take too long, because he did not want to disrupt his family's life for much longer. And no matter the approach I took, he did not want to share his worries with his husband, even though I knew his husband would try to reassure him he was not burdensome. And eventually, he did not wish to discuss it any further with me. And I knew, amidst wonderful laughing and special moments in his room with his family, that he was sitting with these thoughts alone. And so I invite you to begin to think about, when did you encounter non-physical suffering in your work? Which patients or family members, chosen family members, helped you to understand non-physical suffering? And we'll return to this in a few moments. And so when I delved into this topic in the literature and did my first small qualitative study about 5 years ago now, shockingly, talking to clinicians about their work with patients' non-physical suffering, I found this. They were telling me that it's one of the most difficult and distressing aspects of our work, that we feel helpless and inadequate, specifically when we cannot do what the discipline asks us to do. And we lack institutional support in terms of our workplaces not always fully appreciating what it is to work with non-physical suffering, the time it takes, and the toll it takes. Having spent the past several years on a part-time basis pursuing my PhD, I have delved deeply into the suffering literature, and I have found that it presents non-physical suffering on a binary spectrum. That either someone with non-physical suffering can find meaning and transcend their suffering, or else they may need palliative sedation or request a medically assisted death. While both of these ends of the spectrum are indeed viable and possible, I found that the majority of my work on the front lines, what I encountered most, hung out between these two ends, neither meaning-making or suffering's transcendence, nor requiring palliative sedation or a patient necessarily interested in a medically assisted death, but just all of the non-physical suffering I encountered in my day-to-day practice mostly fell between these two ends of the spectrum. And when I didn't see my experience represented in the literature, it added to my feelings of inadequacy and isolation as a frontline clinician. So I've come to realize over the many years I've been focusing on non-physical suffering that my struggle is a collective one. It's our collective struggle, and this is my why. So I don't know exactly, I wasn't sure what the room setup was going to be when I planned this presentation. But feel free to maybe call out and I can repeat them for translation purposes. What words come to mind when you think of non-physical suffering? Please. Distress, sadness, existential, fear, anguish, powerlessness. I think you guys hang out with a lot of suffering. Yeah. Other words. Anxiety. Did I not hear something over there? No? Anything else? Trauma? Yes. Okay. You guys know what you're talking about. So when I asked these same questions to my research participants several years ago, this is what they shared. Things like guilt, worry for those left behind, feeling burdensome, like the patient I was just talking about, regrets, not accepting death, financial distress, death anxiety, loss of personhood, estrangements, etc. And when I asked this question as part of my doctoral dissertation research just a couple of years ago, speaking with palliative care clinicians across Canada, doctors, nurses, social workers, music therapists, etc., a key source of non-physical suffering that those participants articulated was patients not wanting to die. Not wanting to die, in my experience, is not necessarily only around fears of dying, but of profound grief. And so the way of thinking about non-physical suffering that I invite you to consider for your own practice is this. There can be a lot of overlap between these kinds of suffering. So non-physical suffering is suffering that may be emotional, psychological, social, spiritual, and or existential in nature. And again, there can be a lot of overlap between these types of suffering. And so non-physical suffering as a clinical concept provides a way for us to speak to the whole of suffering that is non-physical in nature. With huge respect for the concept of total pain, I'm suggesting that non-physical suffering is different from total pain, which always includes a physical element alongside the non-physical, or a physical manifestation or outcome of non-physical suffering. But non-physical suffering does not always have a physical source or manifestation. And we know from research that patients themselves distinguish sources of non-physical suffering from sources of physical suffering. For example, this was a study, I guess about 10 years ago now, here end-of-life patients referred to those with prognoses of less than 6 months, and about 65 patients were interviewed. And for them, they articulated their suffering stemming half of the time from physical sources and the other half from suffering that was psychological, social, or existential in nature. And not only do patients distinguish physical from non-physical sources of suffering, but we also make those distinctions in our own practice. So for example, my research is showing that we struggle with non-physical suffering more indifferently than physical suffering. We find it more difficult to identify. We find we're not sure how to respond to non-physical suffering. We feel we know better what to do for physical suffering than non-physical. And the helplessness and inadequacy that comes up in the research is specific to our experiences with non-physical suffering. Furthermore, if we think about debates about the role of palliative sedation, that is split between what people think about using that for physical suffering versus non-physical suffering. So I think it's important for us to consider non-physical suffering in these distinct ways. Okay, so I think I wasn't sure again how many folks would be here today, but I was thinking we could spend some time talking to each other in small groups, or if you prefer to just talk to a partner, feel free. But I wanted to create space for folks here today to have the opportunity to literally just voice out loud to someone you may not know and never see again, or maybe it's a colleague you're sitting beside, or if you prefer to talk to someone you don't know and will never see again, consider moving spots. But to briefly describe an experience you have had encountering non-physical suffering in your work, and to share what that was like for you. And I'm suggesting that we do that in a way where it's not a conversation, not to be, that's offered in a spirit of simply voicing without needing to justify or answer questions, but just sharing our own experience. So the idea being that if you're talking to a partner, they share and we listen, and then it's your turn and then they listen. And so if we're going to do that, I wanted to spend another moment talking a little bit about what we might need to cultivate a brave space for ourselves and for each other. Oops, I gave one away already. But any other, what do folks need if they're gonna talk to a stranger about their encounter, or a colleague about encountering non-physical suffering? Because I don't actually know how often we get to just talk about that even with our colleagues. Anything that people might feel they need to have this 2-minute expression experience. Who's feeling, sorry, go ahead. Oh my gosh, Laura, how did you know? That was not planned, by the way. The other one I'm suggesting is just the practice of deep listening, which is, again, listening to hear and not respond. And So I'm thinking, I'm going to go back. Anything else that people need besides confidentiality, judgment, free, and deep listening? Trust. What was that other one? Sure, totally. And the beauty is that we have more time for this session than we originally had. So I love that addition. Yeah, obviously, great. Please feel free to introduce yourself. I'm not trying to be overly strict or police this activity, but I do think there's power in sharing without necessarily having to answer questions or say anything more than what you want to say. Thank you for that. Anything else? Yes. Try not to slime each other with dramatic details. Yes. Totally. I think that's a great thing to share. And I guess for us just to be conscious about what we're sharing. But also, yeah, it's hard to always know like what might be received in a way that's sliming or not, but I totally hear what you're saying. And I think you don't necessarily need to get into the details of the experience necessarily. I mean, you can. But really what I think we often don't get to talk about is number 2, what that was like for us. So how do folks feel kind of either finding a partner or just morphing into some awkward, 3 groups of 3 or 5, and just spending the next 10 minutes trying to be conscious of giving everyone a chance to say an answer to one of these. The other thing I'd like to propose is you can pass. You don't have to do this. Do folks have any questions? Does this feel okay, scary, a little bit both? Open to it? Okay, cool. So I'm going to, let's start, and I'll kind of check in 5 minutes through and give you guys a 5-minute warning, and then after 10 minutes we'll regroup. Thanks, everybody.
took note, yeah. Thank you. Right?
That's an occasion.
Exactly. Yes.
Everyone's just gonna look at me and think that I'm,
Yes.
anyway, it was just really awkward.
Right?
Pressure to smoke. It was so great that I was almost like choking myself. Probably the first, my eyes started closing, it was, I was trying to hold it in. It was an experience.
I feel for that.
So that's the halfway mark, so about 5 more minutes. So about one more minute and then we'll come back together.
Yeah, no, he loves it. He even gets down in the creek, you know, like,
I used to walk on shelves. I know. Okay, well, thanks so much, everyone, for being open to doing that little activity. I wonder if anyone might be open or interested in sharing about what that was like as an experience of talking about that and what working with non-physical suffering is like for you, as opposed to necessarily the content of your experience, but what was it like to give voice to that? And Patrick's gonna run around the room and help us out.
It was cathartic. It was lovely. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Mm.
Oh, please not. Oh, gosh.
Yeah, just for translation, that's one.
I was
as well.
just saying that I think there was resonance within our group. So as the story unfolded and people listened to it, it echoed into people's experiences and their own emotions, and I could imagine that suffering and maybe even experienced it in the past.
Yeah, because we're all hanging out with it. So it's nice to kind of connect around some of it, for sure. Hence the cathartic nature that you were just mentioning. Yeah, anyone else? Or maybe you had a different experience. It's okay if it wasn't either of those things. Yeah. Hi.
For us, it was the different lenses and the different perspectives that it brought. And that was really interesting to learn about those different perspectives.
How each discipline within the team might hang out with non-physical suffering differently. Yeah. Totally.
And I would add also that when I was reading the question, I was thinking automatically, because of the topic, I was briefly describe an experience you've had. So mine was like, oh, what was the difficult experience that I had? Whereas somebody else in the group was talking about, here's, a more positive perspective.
Right.
Of this is what the experience was. So I hadn't looked through that either.
Yep. Because they can be held at the same time. There can be a mixture of experiences within suffering, for sure. Great. Anyone else before we move ahead? Yeah.
I think it's just undeniable that as healthcare providers, we are affected every day by non-physical suffering, and the power there is in sharing it with each other, our experiences, and that we shouldn't really be living these things alone, that we are in multidisciplinary teams for a purpose, and that's so that we can all get through this together.
Absolutely. I think it doesn't get shared due to a variety of reasons. And, it could be busy days in our practice. And one participant in my doctoral research actually named that they were hesitant to share the full impact of a patient suffering with the team for fear of how that might be perceived, like that it was really hanging out with her in a very deep way. And she was a bit newer to the team, so that may have been a component. But it just makes me think about trainees and people new to teams, and even people in longstanding teams, and kind of our comfort around potentially doing that. And if we have those psychologically safe spaces, as Terry Altilio was talking about, if you were here at the start of the day, like what a gift that is to be able to name and voice. Because we do hang out with a lot of suffering. And interestingly, like the word suffering, like I didn't hear it as a trainee, a social worker trainee. And even in my early years in hospice, people didn't really talk about suffering. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Anything else from that experience, since we have a little more time? Yeah, awesome. I love brewing thoughts or questions we're not sure how yet to ask.
So not so much a question,
Mhm.
and something that is a bit of a rub, for myself for
Mhm.
sure, and maybe for others, is I'm not sure that we can always wait for a psychologically safe space.
Right.
I think sometimes, and to the good or the bad and true or not, I'm happy to debate with everyone, but I think sometimes as psychosocial people, we have to lead in vulnerability and kind of step into spaces that maybe don't feel safe and name things that other people don't want to name. So that was just, like, I don't know if a psychologically safe place is always there.
Yeah.
And that doesn't, I think, always compel us to then to not step forward.
100%. And I mean, and in some spaces, you know, there maybe isn't even the psychosocial person on the team. Like in my experience in palliative care consult teams, at least in Ontario, there isn't like specialist social work usually, or whatever it might be. So yeah, but I hear you 100% that if we are on a team, what can we do to help give voice to some of that? Well, thanks for that engagement. Much appreciated. So we're going to move into tips and tools to support your psychosocial practice specific to working with non-physical suffering. And the way I decided to organize this time together is to present kind of 4 overarching themes under which these 10 tips and tools land. So the first 2 are, we can increase our understanding of non-physical suffering. We can understand the barriers to non-physical suffering being shared and explored. We can ask about and specifically explore non-physical suffering. And we can be self-reflexive. So the first overarching theme, we can increase our understanding of non-physical suffering. So we've been talking a little bit about non-physical suffering and what it entails, and I want to take that a bit deeper. And so the first tip and tool is we can consider how suffering is different from distress. Distress and suffering are often used interchangeably, but they are actually thought to be distinct experiences if you do a deep dive into the literature. Suffering is thought to be a more all-encompassing, enduring, and intense experience than distress. So suffering lasts, it persists. Whereas distress is considered to be more of a transient or fleeting experience, as an in-the-moment experience. Also, related to its enduring nature, there is thought to be a temporal or a time component to suffering. That is, in order for a situation to be a source of suffering, it must influence the person's perception of future events. And interestingly, research has shown that palliative care clinicians, in this study I believe it was nurses, use the word distress rather than suffering in their clinical work because it suffering was not a well understood concept, and because they felt they could not fix suffering. So in your own practice, are you using the language of distress when what you may be encountering is actually potentially suffering? And what might it be like to use the language of suffering in your practice, with conversations with your colleagues, in your medical documentation, in your counseling notes? Do you use that word? And so again, when we look at the root of the word suffering, it helps us to understand it a bit more, that it endures, it is carried. So tip number 2, patients' non-physical suffering consists of losses, worries, and fears. While palliative care literature and discourse consistently describe suffering as complex, multifaceted, subjective, and affecting each individual uniquely, and while of course this is ultimately true, a scoping review I completed found that losses, worries, and fears were found to be common and central sources of patients' non-physical suffering across diverse cultures and geographies. I started out with over 400 papers, yeah, it's true, and whittled down to actually, there's been only about 30 studies, actually a few less than 30, but some secondary analyses, only 30 studies published about non-physical suffering since the 1990s. Maybe that's a lot. It didn't seem like a lot to me, considering the centrality of suffering in palliative care practice. And these studies took place in places like Malaysia, Taiwan, Colombia, Spain, Thailand, the UK, Canada, and the US. And across all of these studies, losses, worries, and fears were common themes. These were the sources of patients' non-physical suffering. So what kind of losses were patients talking about? For example, loss of independence, functional losses, loss of control, body image changes, loss of social roles, social identity, feeling isolated and lonely even when surrounded by people that care about patients. And patients were grieving their own existence and grieving the future. What worries were sources of non-physical suffering? Patients across all these cultures and geographies are worried about family and friends. They're worried about how their family and chosen family and friends will cope after they die. They worry imagining their family, their chosen family's future without them. They worry watching their family experience their own illness is a source of non-physical suffering. They worry they are causing worry. And unresolved family dynamics are a source of worry and non-physical suffering. And what fears are sources of non-physical suffering? Fear of the future, uncertainty, fear of future suffering, fear of being burdensome, fear of how death will happen, fear that death will happen. So when you encounter these experiences in the patients you work with, I invite you to consider these moments as encountering non-physical suffering. So the next theme, we have a bit of a better sense of what non-physical suffering is. So I'm going to now look at how we need to understand the barriers to non-physical suffering being shared and explored. So tip number 3 is we can understand that patients are reluctant to share their non-physical suffering with us. Patients experience barriers to expressing their non-physical suffering. What are these barriers? So quite simply, expressing one's non-physical suffering can be hard to do. One study found how difficult it can be for patients to find the words to articulate the nature of their non-physical suffering. Patients, due to their advanced illnesses, can feel too mentally and physically exhausted to articulate their non-physical suffering. They may minimize or underreport it so as to not overwhelm themselves, which is legit. And patients also want to protect us from their suffering, from their non-physical suffering. This actually is a finding from my doctoral research, which found that patients can be very polite with their suffering and not share the whole of it with us because they don't necessarily think that we can hang out there. And if we think about the patients who are very raw and open with their suffering and how that endures and how that's hard and how that sometimes can lead to avoidance as clinicians. So it makes sense that they're being polite, sadly. And we lack, and patients rather can feel that clinicians may be rushed and lack sufficient time. So they feel, you know, we're popping in, they know we have a huge caseload, they don't want to burden us. So they're just not going to go there, even if we ask them, potentially. So there's a lot going on in the internal patient experience. And tip number 4, there's a lot going on in our own experience. So tip number 4 is we can acknowledge that we may be reluctant to specifically explore patients' non-physical suffering. There's a lot of barriers that we face. We lack time. Patients' impressions of our lack of time is legit. We may have very heavy caseloads. And there's also this pressure of the dying time, which really came out in my doctoral research, meaning that a patient's illness can change rapidly, and we may feel that we don't have time to sufficiently explore or support a patient's non-physical suffering. The structure or setting of our role can be a barrier. For example, this paraphrased quote is from, I think it was a social worker in a home care setting. She said something like this, I paraphrased, "I don't want to open up a can of worms and then not be able to see them for 3 weeks." So when you know that there's the nature of your role means that they're not going to have you there for another few weeks, or that you're just going to be busy for the next few hours, you're not necessarily going to necessarily go there. Our inability to fix non-physical suffering or resolve it keeps us from exploring it. We feel inadequate beginning that conversation, so we just don't go there. And we worry that once it is shared, we won't be able to do anything about it. And our lack of training, feeling like we don't know how to help a patient's non-physical suffering. And I just want to extend my gratitude to the translation folks. Like, I continue to be stunned as I hear you translate. My respect to what you are doing over there. Thank you. So let me summarize for a quick moment. Hopefully we all understand a little bit more about what non-physical suffering is, and we understand that patients experience barriers to sharing it with us, and we feel reluctant to explore it. So what does that mean for our practice? So I'm going to suggest that we can specifically explore it. Believe it or not, many of our psychosocial interventions specific to supporting patient suffering do not really create space for non-physical suffering to be specifically explored and expressed. This may just be my opinion, but we focus a lot on an end goal as opposed to what that might be to create space for that. Of course, not all patients will want to share their non-physical suffering with us, and that is, of course, more than okay. But keeping in mind that some will want to and are reluctant to, and that we may have limited time or difficulty identifying a patient's non-physical suffering, how might we specifically and explicitly explore it with patients? What might that sound like? And so this idea is inspired by Dr. Eric Cassell, who famously wrote, The Nature of Suffering and the Goals of Medicine. He wrote, "The only way to learn whether suffering is present is to ask the sufferer." So how might that sound? We can ask, are you suffering right now? In what ways are you suffering? We ask patients a lot of things, but we don't necessarily use the word in our work with patients. And tip number 6, we can ask specifically about losses, worries, and fears related to life-limiting illness, dying, and death. Because losses, worries, and fears make up a lot of the non-physical suffering that patients experience, what if we use that language to specifically explore it? Perhaps the word suffering or asking about suffering may not resonate for a patient, but being asked about these things, about their losses, worries, and fears, might be a helpful starting place. And so, for example, what worries do you have? What fears do you have? What losses have you experienced or are you experiencing? And a quick shout out to a mentor of mine who died a few years ago, Paula Murphy, a brilliant social worker in Massachusetts, who I met through the Smith College End of Life program. And she taught me that when we ask a patient, what concerns do you have? It keeps people up here in their minds and their brains. But when we ask people what worries they have, it gets more to the heart of what's going on with them. And maybe you are already using this type of language, these kinds of questions in your practice, not realizing that they are in support of exploring non-physical suffering. So tip number 7 is we can ask specifically about non-physical suffering that may predate and or be amplified by a life-limiting diagnosis. Something that came up, and this is something that came up in both my smaller study about 5 years ago and my dissertation study more recently, is that we as clinicians encounter a lot of non-physical suffering that predates and or may be amplified by a life-limiting diagnosis. And this isn't readily acknowledged in the palliative care literature. A lot of this kind of non-physical suffering, too, cannot necessarily be fixed or resolved, but we can support it. We can potentially create space for its expression if patients want to express it. For example, study participants identified an individual's trauma history as a source of non-physical suffering that may predate and be amplified by a life-limiting diagnosis. Family estrangements have come up in my research as a source of this type of suffering. And one participant in my dissertation study shared how accessing palliative care, which is often provided in institutional settings like hospitals, may amplify ongoing colonial trauma experienced by Indigenous peoples who have historically been harmed and continue to be harmed by healthcare systems. So how this tip might sound in practice could be, are there other ways in which you are experiencing suffering? Are there other worries, fears, or losses that you are experiencing right now? So tip number 7.5, I have one extra tip that I wanted to sneak in. We can think about, or we can ask about non-physical suffering earlier in the illness trajectory. Sometimes I think we can tend to think about non-physical suffering related to dying and less about suffering that accompanies living with a life-limiting illness or that might be present at the time of diagnosis. And so participants in my dissertation study told me repeatedly that often in palliative care, we meet patients whose non-physical suffering was not explored earlier. And there can be so much less time available by the time we meet them in hospice care or in an inpatient palliative care unit. What might happen if we asked specifically about non-physical suffering earlier? What if we use the language of suffering earlier in the illness trajectory in our work with patients? What might be revealed or become known? And tip number 8, we're getting there. We can sit with patients and families, chosen families, in their intrinsic, non-physical suffering. We can sit with them in what's hard and unchangeable. This draws upon my work with Dr. Joan Berzoff, a social work scholar and leader in palliative care who was involved in a lot of the work Terry was talking about earlier today in the US. We wrote a paper together about 6 or 7 years ago now about how some suffering is intrinsic. And what does that mean? Intrinsic is defined as occurring as a natural part of something or being a part of the innermost nature of a person or thing. So intrinsic non-physical suffering acknowledges that a lot of non-physical suffering we encounter in palliative care just is. A lot of the worries, losses, and fears we cannot necessarily relieve or take away entirely, if at all. The concept of intrinsic suffering goes beyond ideas of presence or bearing witness, which of course are both very important, but it goes a bit beyond these things. It includes validating and normalizing the non-physical suffering that cannot necessarily be relieved. Whether it's feeling burdensome, like the dad I talked about at the start of my presentation, whether it's patients' feelings of loneliness or aloneness, despite being surrounded by people who care about them, or whether it's worry for how family, chosen family, and friends will fare after death happens. These are all aspects of intrinsic non-physical suffering that cannot necessarily be relieved. And so we can educate patients and families about this because they too can put a lot of pressure on themselves for dying to look a particular way, for coping to look a particular way. We can tell them, this is actually one of the many hard parts of dying. I'm not sure that worry or fear can be taken away entirely. And sitting with intrinsic non-physical suffering helps to relieve patients and families not from the suffering, but from the pressure to feel differently than they do. It also acknowledges that meaning-making is not always the antidote to suffering, an idea and approach that dominates the palliative care discourse and practice. The concept of intrinsic non-physical suffering offers a different lens. It offers a way for us to support patients and for us to help patients view and understand their own experience in that they may hold non-physical suffering concurrent to moments of meaning, personal growth, acceptance, etc. That it's not necessarily one or the other, or that a psychosocial intervention will absolve a person of their suffering, but rather patients and families are hanging out with this complexity of experience, and we can support them in holding both and everything in between. And finally, the last overarching theme, we can be self-reflexive. So what is reflexivity? It's a term that is used in research and definitely in social work practice. I'm not sure about in other disciplines. I would love to hear if folks have encountered it. But it's a focus, as Wanda Pillow writes, it's a focus on how does who I am, who I have been, who I think I am, and how I feel affect how I approach my work. And specifically here, how does it affect how I approach my work with non-physical suffering? And this is inspired by a finding that came out in both of my research studies. I've only done 2. Still a very novice researcher, talking to clinicians about their work with non-physical suffering. And really, what came out is that our own worldview on suffering really affects how we take care of our patients who are suffering. And if we think about the amazing Dame Cicely Saunders and her conceptualizations of suffering and meaning as the antidote to suffering, those were very much informed not only by Viktor Frankl's work, but by her own religious and Christian views of suffering and of dying. And so our own worldview on suffering can really affect how we might approach our work with suffering. So the 9th tip-in tool is we can reflect on how am I impacting the encounter, the patient encounter, the family encounter, and how is the encounter impacting me? Specifically, what of my own personal history, biography, values, experiences impact how I approach working with patients' non-physical suffering? What expectations or assumptions am I unknowingly bringing about non-physical suffering to my work for myself and for my patients potentially? And as David Browning, a social worker in the States, put it so well when he wrote, as caregivers, referring to us as clinicians, we must be watchful of the manner in which our own need for meaning and a sense of transcendence may function as a method of managing the feelings of anxiety and horror that accompany our bearing witness to suffering that is unrelieved. So I invite you to think about how, in your own practice, your approaches to working with non-physical suffering, is any of that informed by your own needs? And if it is, that's very common, but to reflect on that and to think about what might be going on there. So some questions to help us be reflexive, leading up to the clinical moment, in the clinical moment, or after, in the human moment with another person, with a family. Am I feeling helpless? Am I feeling inadequate? Am I feeling frustrated? That is another key thing that came out of my dissertation research, that when patients don't do what we want them to do and when we can't do what we want to do, we feel very frustrated. And am I avoiding exploring or moving into a patient's non-physical suffering? And if I am, what's that all about? And finally, tip number 10, I invite you to recognize how your own feelings of helplessness, inadequacy, frustration, discomfort, sadness, all the things we hang out with in our practice might be things that help us sit and stay with non-physical suffering. When we notice these things within ourselves, rather than thinking we have to feel differently or possibly having these feelings lead us to avoid patients' non-physical suffering, we can recognize that they are common feelings. They can be cues to help us sit and stay with patients in their experience and our own. So there's my summary for you. 10 tips and tools. And I thank you, and I welcome questions, comments, thoughts. And I have my email in the next slide I can share.
Everyone's reflecting.
I know, I love it. It's okay too if there's no questions, but I guess we have about 20 minutes or. Thank you. What's that? Any comments or discussion points or other ideas, different ideas? I welcome dialogue, feedback. If it resonates, if it doesn't resonate, all is welcome. Yes.
I didn't even get to hear all of your talk. I'm very sorry. Carla Alexander from Baltimore.
Oh, welcome.
But I really appreciate your tips. But I mean, I just was wondering, sometimes it's the words, we talked about this in a previous session, but it's actually for physicians, I think, or for all of us, it's just not really having the right word.
Yeah.
You know, and that's really, the thing that stands between us sometimes and being able to say those things.
Yes.
But that was wonderful.
For sure. Yeah. And
Thank you.
I mean, I guess one of the things, I'm not sure if you were here at that moment, but trying to help give words to help us ask about it and to move into it, because clinicians tell me that they don't know how to identify it. They don't know how to ask about it. Patients are reluctant. So how can we lead in that way and use questions like, what worries do you have? Are you experiencing suffering, as a way to just go there purposefully? Seems very simple, but believe it or not, it's not something that I encountered in the literature as a beginning clinician. And so again, going back to my why, how to help us with all the non-physical suffering we hang out with.
But for my patient population, it's a primarily African American people who live in the inner city and have multiple losses, and certainly have very strong PTSD-like responses to their environment.
Yeah.
It really is quite difficult to raise those issues. To say any of these things, because there's so many layers of protection
Right.
there. And I think, that's why we have social workers and love you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi.
I just want to say thank you for doing this work, Maxine. Keep doing it.
Thank you, Marnie.
It's a piece of work and such a fundamental part of our practice that I think doesn't get
Named.
called out and
Yeah.
understood and built on. So thank you so much. Two things I wanted to say as I was listening. One is my work predominantly now is with bereaved people.
Yeah.
And I often feel as a grief counselor like I wish I had the people around the bereaved person come in instead of the bereaved person. Because I think if we weren't so afraid to lean into hard places, then those bereaved people would be better supported.
Yeah.
And so I think about that with non-physical suffering
Yeah.
too. Like, it's not that we need to come with the magic wand or the answer or the solution, but just to be present with another human being in their suffering.
Yeah.
So I think that's just so important, that we might not know how to make it better or fix it. And maybe that's a good thing. But what we can do is break down the isolation that people feel in those times of suffering. So I wanted to say that. And then the other thing I thought of around your last bit on self-reflexive practice, I think of how often as a new counselor on my team, I got sent down the hall to deal with something that was somebody else's non-physical suffering with the suffering of the patient. And I think that happens a whole lot to us in our practice, that someone on our team is struggling with a patient who's struggling and wants us to go in and fix it so that they can do the things they need to do.
100%. Thanks for saying that and for your enduring support, Marnie. But it reminds me how in my doctoral research, which I need to defend in 3 weeks, so wish me luck with that, that social workers are like, non-physical suffering, that's my gig. Like, basically, like, that's what all the team members, like, kind of funnel off to and be like, that's what I'm expected to be able to do something with. And one of my colleagues used to say, like, not my circus, not my monkey. Like, there's no, you can't always fix it. But absolutely. And the other comment you made, just to reinforce that, again, I have found that the pressure we feel to help people feel differently than they do is something that they sit with. Patients, I remember having a gentleman, maybe in his early 70s, he's like, Maxine, I'm a very positive person. I'm really struggling with my dying. And I'm like, that makes sense. And I couldn't, and just for him to know that he didn't have to, like, shift how he was feeling. I think a lot of our interventions try to shift feelings, and I think that can happen. But I also think a lot of the times it doesn't necessarily happen, and that's just what it is to live with and die from a life-limiting illness for a lot of people. So I just wanted to name that too. Yeah.
One of the questions I have,
Yeah.
is just, I guess, and then this obviously reflects my sort of worldview, but I would say my most
Mm-hmm.
And so I often think of the chaplain as the spiritual counselor on the team as the one who sort of addresses.
Oh, they can't hear. It's not working. Sorry. Apologies, I didn't see that before. Sorry about that.
No problem. Better?
Is this okay? Back there? Yeah? Okay. Yep.
I have a chance to be more efficient in asking.
You were doing great.
I tend to associate suffering outside of palliative care into more of a spiritual realm. So when I think about how to address suffering, particularly non-physical suffering, I often think that that's the role of the chaplain or the spiritual care person.
Mm-hmm.
So one is to think about how do we, if we're in the luxury of having access to both social workers and spiritual care providers, like how do we determine who is the best person, and how do you as a social worker sort of think about that collaborative relationship and where there's overlap and where there's specific separation?
Mm-hmm.
And how can you help us who are less versed in managing non-physical suffering, like as a physician on the team, in making sure we identify it and connect them with, either a chaplain or a social worker or both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would say that I don't have an answer because I imagine teams kind of hang out with that stuff in different ways. But I guess, definitely something that comes out in my research is like people who aren't social workers. Unfortunately, I didn't have chaplains in my study as much as I would have liked that. People who aren't social workers struggling with whether non-physical suffering falls within their scope of practice, encountering it a lot in clinical moments, and then kind of passing it off to another team member and like struggling with that. So, I mean, I guess all I have to say is, I think that different members of the team obviously can come in and support. But I would hope that maybe part of what I'm hoping in my work writ large is to invite each of us, no matter our discipline, to hang out in that moment and to ultimately engage the team. But if I always think about, patients choose who they sometimes share their non-physical suffering with. And so because it transcends all of our disciplines, it's very natural to be like, how do I get another team member involved? That, and I would invite us to think, what does that mean for me to sit with that, and what can I still offer in the moment, and to not doubt that you maybe have something to offer in the moment, if I may be so, and invite you to think about. Yeah. I know that didn't answer your question, but I think chaplains and social workers kind of navigate that in different ways. Yeah, it's hard to say like a one way. I think it just depends on the moment too, how things come up, who's around. And if other people have insights to share, they are very welcome around that question. Yay!
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Sherry from Vancouver.
Yay.
Palliative care unit at BGH. So I work fairly closely with the chaplain, the spiritual care that we have on our unit. I ask the patient to start, and then if they, sometimes they'll be like, oh, I'm not spiritual or whatever.
Right.
But often they will just be, sometimes another's just source of support. And I find that they don't go in with an agenda. It's more of a listening ear, and then they kind of will proceed as they wish.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm lucky enough that myself and the spiritual care will debrief with each other about the support we're giving and liaise together often. And then, and then sometimes it's fairly independent. Families will bring in their own priests and things like that, and that's usually just kind of separate from me.
Mm-hmm.
But I do appreciate the role that spiritual care plays.
100%. 100%. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Yay, spiritual care, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, any other questions or feedback or thoughts?
I just wanted to speak for creative art therapists as well.
Hey.
So when you're lucky enough to have some of us on
Yes.
your unit, we provide creative arts that can be very spiritual, and they can bypass the feelings of I am religious or I am not, or I am spiritual or I am not.
Yes.
Because it's so enigmatic and we can't touch it, oftentimes it's a very safe container. So if you have access to creative art therapists, or you can find any who specialize in palliative care, I definitely suggest that you hire them.
Yes.
Or have them with you, because I think it's everybody's responsibility to deal with suffering.
Yeah.
I don't really care what role you are. And we're human, and we can identify suffering very easily, actually, because if we're listening to ourselves, we know what it feels like to be with someone who's suffering. So that was Balfour Mount's dream. The father of palliative care was that we never work alone, that we are a multidisciplinary team, and we are powerful together.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And yay, art therapists. Yeah. I had the great pleasure of, actually, interestingly, didn't have a full-time or like barely, I only had a part-time chaplain on my team, but profoundly appreciate that role. We had more presence of music therapy and art therapy, and definitely both spiritual experiences. And again, also it transcends the spiritual, but yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing that. Awesome.
It's off now. Oh, there we go. That I wanted you to speak to, or wonder what your
Sure.
thoughts are, and anybody in the room too. We've talked about a number of barriers for non-physical suffering and addressing it, but I'm wondering how much our kind of social and cultural attitudes about vulnerability, about weak, about strong, come into play in terms of both the patient's willingness, ability, and trust to kind of go there with us, but also our own. And for you with a social work background, I think there's, that kind of awareness of what else is influencing our ability to have those kinds of conversations. And how do we reinforce that in our healthcare work and teams?
Wouldn't that be amazing if that was reinforced? Yeah, I take that in and don't necessarily have anything to speak to around it, but yeah, I hear you and I agree with you. Yeah, I think there's just a lot of, I think we are deeply impacted by our work with non-physical suffering, but sometimes I think we can, I remember one experience I had where I felt that I could only be impacted so much, or else I might be seen to be like something wrong with me. When really, a sister of a patient, the patient was a sister to 4 adult siblings, and they had been disserved by the healthcare system because English was not their first language, and they arrived in the hospice, and she died shortly thereafter. And I'm very close with my sister, and so watching them lose a sister, and then the injustice of the system, it's again very natural to be like impacted by that. But I just remember feeling like I couldn't be too impacted in that moment, because then my manager might think I can't X, Y, and Z. So just, again, like the fullness, the depth of the work, we don't necessarily get to share it with people, and we don't necessarily have spaces to really talk about it. In my experience, much respect to all the management folks out there, but teams won't really talk about the impact of suffering if management is present, in my experience. So, and even if you get to talk about it, that's even and then if you do and your manager's there, you don't feel comfortable. So yeah, lots of complexity about how and if we allow ourselves to vulnerably share. Any other thoughts in our last few minutes, and then I can turn it back over to Zelda and Patrick. Well, thanks for your rapt attention and my gratitude. Thanks, everybody.